Hey there! Tonight we're diving into one of technology's most overhyped promises, virtual reality. You've probably heard the breathless predictions about how VR will revolutionize gaming, transform social interaction, and create entirely new digital universes where we'll spend most of our waking hours. We're about to explore why those predictions were spectacularly wrong, and why the future of computing is probably not strapping a half-pound electronic brick to your face. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like or subscribe. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations. You've just spent $3,500 on the latest premium VR headset. Convinced by marketing materials showing people laughing joyfully while exploring photorealistic virtual worlds, you're about to strap this device to your head and discover that the reality of virtual reality is motion sickness so severe you'll be questioning your life choices within 8 minutes and wondering if you can return opened electronics to Best Buy within 7 minutes after that. The unboxing experience starts promisingly enough. The packaging is premium. The headset looks sleek and futuristic, and the setup guide features pictures of attractive people wearing the device with expressions suggesting they've achieved enlightenment rather than strapped expensive electronics to their faces. What the guide doesn't mention is that you're about to begin a relationship with technology that will make you intimately familiar with nausea, neck pain, and the sinking feeling that comes from realizing you've been sold a science fiction fantasy that physics refuses to cooperate with. The headset itself weighs about as much as a large grapefruit, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that this grapefruit will be strapped to your face, pulling your head forward with relentless gravitational insistence for hours at a time. The weight distribution is supposedly ergonomic, optimized through years of industrial design research. But it turns out that there's no ergonomic way to attach 500 grams of electronics to a human skull without that human skull eventually staging a protest through the medium of neck pain. The foam padding that interfaces between your face and the headset promises comfort through advanced materials engineering. But what it actually delivers is a sweat collection system that would impress athletic equipment designers if they were designing products specifically to make users uncomfortable. Within 10 minutes of wearing the headset, your face will be generating moisture at rates typically associated with cardiovascular exercise. And this moisture will be trapped against your skin by foam that seems designed to maximize dampness while minimizing breathability. The setup process reveals the first hint that VR might not be the plug-and-play experience that marketing materials suggested. You need to clear a space in your room that's at least 6 feet by 6 feet, which means moving furniture, removing hazards, and explaining to family members why the living room now looks like a padded cell designed by someone who doesn't understand interior design. The tracking sensors need to be mounted on walls at specific heights and angles, requiring drilling holes or adhesive mounting that your landlord definitely didn't approve in your lease agreement. The cable management situation approaches nightmare status if you've purchased a tethered headset, which most people have because wireless VR headsets cost even more money and die after 2 hours of use. The cable connecting your headset to your computer is thick, stiff, and determined to tangle itself around your legs while you're trying to enjoy immersive experiences. This cable represents a constant physical reminder that you're not actually in a virtual world, but rather attached to expensive electronics through an umbilical cord that's actively trying to trip you. Your first experience launching a VR application starts with putting on the headset, which requires adjusting multiple straps to achieve a fit that's tight enough to prevent light leakage, but not so tight that it causes immediate headaches or restricts blood flow to your face. Finding this perfect adjustment takes approximately 15 minutes and will need to be repeated every time you put on the headset because the straps mysteriously loosen themselves when the device is stored. The moment you enter virtual reality for the first time should be magical. According to every VR evangelist who's ever written about the technology, what actually happens is that you find yourself looking at a slightly blurry environment through what appears to be a screen door, because that's essentially what you're doing. The screen door effect, caused by the visible gaps between pixels, destroys immersion faster than any technical limitation you could imagine. Instead of believing you're in another world, you're constantly aware that you're looking at a display that's approximately 2 inches from your eyeballs. The resolution of current VR headsets sounds impressive in specification. 2800 by 2800 pixels per eye seems like it should be enough to create convincing virtual environments. But when those pixels are magnified by lenses and spread across your entire field of view, the result is that everything looks slightly fuzzy, like you're viewing the world through glasses that aren't quite the right prescription. Text is particularly problematic, requiring you to physically lean forward to read anything smaller than large headlines, which defeats the purpose of virtual desktop applications that promise to replace your physical monitors. Your virgin voyage into VR likely involves a game or experience that's been specifically designed to minimize motion sickness, which should be your first hint that motion sickness is a significant problem that the industry hopes you won't notice until after the return window closes. These introductory experiences move slowly. Avoid rapid camera movements and generally treat you like someone who might vomit at any moment, which turns out to be accurate assessment of your situation. Motion sickness in VR occurs because your visual system is telling your brain that you're moving through space, while your vestibular system, which controls balance and spatial orientation, is insisting that you're standing still in your living room. This sensory conflict triggers the same response that occurs when you experience food poisoning, because your brain evolved to interpret conflicting sensory information as evidence that you've been poisoned and need to immediately expel stomach contents to avoid further contamination. The nausea starts subtly. You might notice a slight queasiness that you initially dismiss as nervousness or excitement within a few minutes. This queasiness intensifies into genuine nausea that makes you start considering whether you should remove the headset or power through in hopes that you'll adapt. The VR evangelists assured you that adaptation occurs, that your brain learns to resolve the sensory conflict, and that eventually you'll be able to spend hours in VR without discomfort. What the evangelists failed to mention is that adaptation rates vary dramatically between individuals, with approximately 20 to 30% of people never adapting regardless of exposure time. They also neglected to mention that even people who do adapt often experience persistent low-grade nausea that they learn to tolerate rather than actually eliminate. And they definitely didn't mention that motion sickness symptoms can persist for hours after removing the headset, creating a hangover effect that makes VR sessions feel like voluntary illness. Your first session probably lasts between 8 and 15 minutes before the nausea becomes too intense to ignore. You remove the headset with relief, discovering that your face is damp with sweat, your hair is compressed into unfortunate shapes, and you have red marks around your eyes and forehead that will take an hour to fade. You also discover that the room seems to be moving slightly, that focusing on objects requires more effort than usual, and that you're experiencing a dissociative feeling that makes reality seem less real than it did before you entered virtual reality. The technical failures begin almost immediately once you progress beyond carefully curated introductory experiences. Controller tracking loses precision randomly, causing your virtual hands to drift away from where your physical hands are located. This tracking loss is particularly problematic during games that require precise movements. transforming potentially enjoyable experiences into frustrating exercises in fighting technology that's supposed to be invisible. The screen door effect that you noticed immediately never goes away. Your brain doesn't learn to ignore it like VR promoters suggested. Instead, you become increasingly aware of the technological limitations that separate you from the immersive experiences that marketing materials promised. Every visible pixel gap, every moment of resolution inadequacy, every instance where text is unreadable without physical movement reminds you that you're wearing a display device rather than experiencing another reality. The field of view, marketed as immersive 110 degrees, actually feels like looking through binoculars. Once you're accustomed to human vision's 180-degree horizontal field of view, the peripheral vision that you rely on constantly in physical reality simply doesn't exist in VR, creating a tunnel vision effect that's particularly disorienting when combined with the other sensory conflicts that VR creates. The refresh rate issues manifest as stuttering or judder when the system can't maintain the high frame rates that VR requires to avoid motion sickness. Modern VR headsets need to maintain at least 90 frames per second, preferably 120, to minimize nausea. When frame rates drop below these thresholds, even temporarily, the motion sickness that you were barely managing suddenly intensifies into overwhelming nausea that forces immediate session termination. Your expensive gaming computer, which seemed more than adequate for traditional gaming, struggles to render VR environments at the resolution and frame rates that headsets demand. You're now looking at additional hardware upgrades that could easily cost another $2,000, bringing your total investment in VR to over $5,000 before you've played a single game that justifies this expense. The content library that you browse after your first disappointing session reveals another dimension of VR's problems. The highly rated games and experiences number in the dozens rather than the thousands that traditional gaming offers. Many of these titles are short experiences that last 15 to 30 minutes and cost $30, representing worse value than movie tickets when calculated on a per-minute entertainment basis. The games that offer longer playtimes often feel like tech demos that were stretched into full products through repetitive gameplay mechanics. The VR-exclusive titles rarely justify the hardware investment compared to traditional games that offer hundreds of hours of content for $60. The ported titles from traditional gaming often feel awkward in VR, with control schemes and gameplay mechanics that were designed for flat screens, creating frustration when adapted to three-dimensional interaction. As your first day with VR concludes, you're facing the uncomfortable realization that you've spent thousands of dollars on technology that makes you nauseous, uncomfortable, and isolated from the physical world. The revolutionary future of computing that you were promised looks more like an expensive hobby that requires tolerance for technical limitations, physical discomfort, and content scarcity that makes early adopter status feel less like innovation leadership and more like paying premium prices to beta test unfinished technology. Tonight, you'll sleep with a slight headache from eye strain, residual nausea from vestibular conflict, and growing skepticism about whether the VR industry's promises will ever match the reality of putting electronic displays 2 inches from your eyeballs and hoping your brain accepts this as a reasonable way to experience computing. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to explore VR's limitations, new physical discomfort to discover, and new understanding of why technologies that sound revolutionary in marketing materials often fail when confronted with human physiology that evolved for entirely different sensory experiences. Your second week with your VR headset begins with a determination to push through the initial discomfort and achieve the adaptation that every VR enthusiast insists is possible with enough exposure. You've read forum posts from true believers who claim that motion sickness disappears after a few sessions. that your neck muscles strengthen to support the headset weight, and that the immersion eventually becomes so compelling that you forget about the physical limitations. What you're about to discover is that the human body has limits that no amount of determination can overcome, and that some people are selling comfort they've never actually achieved. The motion sickness that you hoped would diminish with exposure has instead become more predictable and, in some ways, more insidious. You can now identify the exact moment when nausea will begin based on specific types of virtual movement, smooth locomotion, where your avatar glides through virtual spaces while your body remains stationary. Triggers nausea within 60 seconds. Rapid camera rotation causes immediate disorientation that borders on vertigo. Even teleportation mechanics, designed specifically to minimize motion sickness, create a dissonance that leaves you feeling vaguely unwell. The vestibular conflict that causes VR motion sickness operates through mechanisms that evolution spent millions of years perfecting, and your few hours of VR exposure aren't going to override that evolutionary programming. When your visual system reports movement that your inner ear contradicts, your brain interprets this conflict as evidence of poisoning, because throughout human history, the primary cause of sensory conflict was ingesting toxic substances that disrupted neural processing. The resulting nausea is your brain's attempt to save your life by expelling the poison it believes you've consumed. Some people do adapt to VR motion sickness, developing tolerance through repeated exposure that gradually trains their brains to accept the sensory conflict without triggering nausea responses. But this adaptation is neither universal nor permanent. Studies suggest that 20 to 30% of people never adapt, regardless of exposure time, condemned by their physiology to experience motion sickness every time they use VR. Even people who do adapt often find that breaks from VR reset their tolerance, requiring readaptation periods after vacations or extended time away from headsets. The adaptation process itself is unpleasant in ways that VR evangelists rarely acknowledge. Building tolerance to motion sickness requires repeatedly exposing yourself to experiences that make you nauseous, essentially training your body through systematic discomfort that resembles exposure therapy for phobias. Each session pushes slightly further into nausea territory, hoping to expand your tolerance envelope without triggering vomiting that would end the session and potentially create lasting aversion to VR. Your second VR session of the week lasts 12 minutes before the nausea becomes unbearable, representing modest improvement over your first session's 8-minute tolerance. But this improvement came at the cost of spending 12 minutes feeling progressively more sick, and the nausea persists for 3 hours after removing the headset. You're essentially volunteering for illness in exchange for the possibility of eventually tolerating technology that makes you sick, which seems like questionable decision-making when examined objectively. The physical injuries that VR enables represent another category of problems that marketing materials carefully avoid mentioning. Room-scale VR encourages physical movement through virtual spaces, which sounds liberating until you punch your wall while fighting virtual enemies, smash your television while reaching for virtual objects, or clothesline family members who walk through your play space without realizing you can't see them through your headset. The Guardian system that's supposed to prevent these collisions works by displaying virtual walls when you approach your defined play space boundaries. But these walls appear only when you're already very close to real walls, and the momentum of your movements often carries you through the virtual barriers before you can react. The Guardian system also doesn't detect obstacles that appear after you've defined your play space, like pets, children, or furniture that's been moved by other household members. Your first room-scale injury occurs during a boxing game when you throw a particularly enthusiastic punch that connects solidly with your bedroom wall instead of the virtual opponent. The pain is immediate and severe, made worse by the disorientation of removing your headset to assess the damage while still feeling the adrenaline of virtual combat. Your knuckles are bruised. Your wall has a dent that your landlord will definitely notice. And you've learned that physical consequences of virtual actions are very real despite occurring in contexts that feel like games. The cable connecting your headset to your computer presents constant trip hazards that transform your play space into an obstacle course where the obstacles are invisible while you're wearing the headset. You've developed strategies for cable management, like routing it over your shoulder and periodically spinning to unwind twists. But these strategies fail regularly when you're focused on virtual experiences and forget about physical tethers. Your first cable-induced fall happens during a rhythm game when you step backward onto the cable, which catches your ankle and sends you crashing to the floor with 500 grams of electronics strapped to your face. The headset survives the impact, which is fortunate because you definitely can't afford to replace it. Your tailbone is less fortunate, developing a bruise that makes sitting uncomfortable for the next week and serves as persistent reminder that virtual reality has physical consequences that extend beyond the intended experience. The neck strain from extended headset wear manifests as a dull ache that starts at the base of your skull and radiates down your spine. The headset's 500 grams create constant forward pull that your neck muscles must resist to maintain upright posture. After an hour of VR, these muscles are fatigued in ways that make simple tasks like looking up or turning your head feel laborious. After 2 hours, the strain develops into genuine pain that persists for hours after removing the headset. The ergonomic designs that promise to distribute headset weight evenly across your head ultimately can't overcome the fundamental problem that you're attaching significant mass to a body part that evolved for different weight distributions. Some users develop chronic neck problems from extended VR use, requiring physical therapy or medical intervention to address musculoskeletal damage caused by what's marketed as entertainment technology. The eye strain from VR use operates through multiple mechanisms that combine to create discomfort that ranges from mild irritation to debilitating headaches. The vergence accommodation conflict occurs because your eyes focus at a fixed distance, the physical distance to the displays, while converging to different distances based on virtual object placement. This conflict between focusing and converging creates eye strain that intensifies with exposure and can persist for hours after removing the headset. Your eyes are also working harder in VR than in normal vision because they're staring at screens that are 2 inches away for extended periods. Normal human vision involves regularly shifting focus between near and far objects, a process that exercises eye muscles and prevents strain. VR eliminates this focus variation, forcing your eyes to maintain fixed focus for unnaturally long periods that create fatigue and discomfort. The blue light emission from VR displays adds another source of eye strain while potentially disrupting sleep patterns if you use VR in the evening. The high-energy visible light that screens emit can damage retinal cells with extended exposure. Though the long-term effects of VR-level exposure are still being studied because the technology hasn't existed long enough to observe lifetime consequences. The dry eye problems in VR result from reduced blink rates that occur when you're visually engaged with displays. Normal blinking happens about 15 times per minute, spreading tear film across your eyes to maintain moisture and clarity. VR users often reduce blinking to 5 to 7 times per minute, creating insufficient tear distribution that leads to dry, irritated eyes that feel gritty and uncomfortable. The psychological isolation that VR creates represents perhaps the most insidious physical consequence because it's not immediately recognized as a physical problem. When you're wearing a headset, You're completely cut off from your physical environment. You can't see family members trying to get your attention, can't hear conversations happening in the same room, and can't respond to situations that require awareness of your surroundings. This isolation creates social problems that extend beyond simple unavailability. Family members feel ignored when you're wearing a headset, even if you're in the same room. The barrier that the headset creates is both physical and psychological, transforming your presence from engaged family member to unavailable person who's chosen virtual experiences over real relationships. Children particularly struggle with parents who are physically present but experientially absent, creating resentment that VR users often don't recognize until damage to relationships has already occurred. The reality dissociation that extended VR use can create manifests as difficulty readjusting to physical reality after virtual experiences. When you remove the headset after hour-long sessions, the physical world sometimes feels less real than it did before, like you're still partially in the virtual environment. This dissociation typically fades within minutes. But regular VR users report increasing difficulty maintaining clear boundaries between virtual and physical experiences. The hygiene problems inherent in VR headset design create health hazards that manufacturers prefer not to discuss in marketing materials. The foam padding that contacts your face absorbs sweat, oils, and dead skin cells during every use. This organic material creates ideal conditions for bacterial and fungal growth, transforming your headset into a facial infection incubator if not cleaned properly. Cleaning VR headsets properly is nearly impossible because the electronics can't be submerged or heavily moistened. Limiting cleaning to surface wiping that doesn't penetrate foam pores where bacteria colonize. Replacement face interfaces are available but cost $60 to $100 and still face the same fundamental limitation that foam padding touching sweaty faces will inevitably become contaminated with biological material. Shared VR headsets, like those used in demos or multi-user households, create particularly concerning hygiene situations. Each user transfers their facial bacteria, oils, and potential pathogens to the face interface, which then contacts the next user's face. Skin infections, particularly around the eyes and forehead where headset pressure is greatest, spread easily through shared headsets that aren't properly sanitized between users. The odor that develops in well-used headsets represents the olfactory evidence of the hygiene problems that visual inspection might miss. Despite regular cleaning attempts, headsets develop distinctive smells that combine sweat, skin oils, and bacterial metabolic byproducts into aromas that range from unpleasant to genuinely offensive. This smell becomes noticeable to users and anyone nearby, creating social awkwardness around technology that's supposed to enable social connection. The heat buildup inside VR headsets creates additional discomfort that intensifies with use duration. The enclosed design that blocks external light also traps heat generated by displays, processors, and your face. Within minutes of use, your face temperature rises noticeably. After 30 minutes, you're sweating, regardless of ambient temperature or physical activity level. After an hour, your face feels flushed and overheated in ways that make removing the headset feel like emerging from a sauna. As your second week with VR concludes, you've accumulated a growing catalog of physical complaints that include neck pain, eye strain, residual nausea, bruised knuckles from wall impacts, and a tailbone injury from cable-induced falls. The revolutionary technology that promised to transport you to other worlds has primarily transported you to increased awareness of your physical body's limitations and vulnerability to technology that wasn't designed with human comfort as a primary consideration. Tonight, you'll sleep with a heating pad on your neck, eye drops on your nightstand for the dry eye problems that persist after headset removal, and growing certainty that perhaps the future of computing should involve less rather than more intimate contact between humans and display technologies that cause this much physical discomfort, tomorrow will bring new physical consequences to discover. New opportunities to question whether immersion justifies this level of bodily punishment, and new understanding of why some technologies remain niche products despite enormous corporate investments and marketing campaigns. Your third week with your VR headset begins with a browse through the digital storefronts that promise thousands of immersive experiences ready to justify your hardware investment. What you discover instead is a content library that makes early smartphone app stores look curated and quality-focused by comparison. The VR marketplace is a wasteland of abandoned projects, shameless cash grabs, and tech demos masquerading as full games, all priced as if scarcity somehow creates value rather than simply reflecting that almost nobody wants to develop content for a platform with 3% market penetration. The highly rated VR games, those titles that reviewers and enthusiasts point to as proof that VR has arrived as a legitimate gaming platform, number in the dozens rather than the hundreds or thousands that traditional gaming offers. These standout titles represent years of development and millions in investment, creating experiences that genuinely showcase VR's potential. They're also outnumbered 50-1 by shovelware that exists solely to extract money from early adopters who are desperate for content and willing to gamble $30 on anything that promises to be the next great VR experience. Your first purchase after the bundled games that came with your headset is a highly rated puzzle game that reviewers describe as essential VR. The game costs $40, which seems steep for a puzzle game, but you're committed to finding content that justifies your hardware investment. What you discover is a genuinely clever puzzle experience that lasts approximately 3 hours before you've completed all available content, making this the most expensive puzzle game you've ever purchased on a per-hour entertainment basis. The replay value of VR games represents one of the medium's most significant content problems. Traditional games often provide 50 to 100 hours of content for $60. With multiplayer titles offering potentially infinite replayability, VR games rarely exceed 10 hours of unique content, and most provide 2 to 4 hours before you've experienced everything they have to offer. The three-dimensional interaction that makes VR unique also makes content creation exponentially more expensive and time-consuming, resulting in shorter experiences that cost more to produce and purchase. The tech demo problem pervades VR storefronts with shameless transparency. Developers create 15-minute experiences that demonstrate a single mechanic or concept, then price these demos at $20 to $30, as if duration is irrelevant to value. You purchase several of these experiences before recognizing the pattern, each time hoping that this one will be the exception. Each time discovering that you've paid $30 for what amounts to a proof of concept that traditional game developers would include as a tutorial level. The asset flip epidemic that plagues traditional gaming platforms achieves new heights of audacity in VR marketplaces. Developers purchase generic 3D assets, apply minimal VR interaction mechanics, and release these compilations as original games priced identically to titles that required years of actual development. These asset flips are often virtually unplayable, with interaction mechanics that barely function and performance optimization that's non-existent, but they flood storefronts and make finding legitimate quality content increasingly difficult. Your growing library of VR purchases begins to resemble a museum of disappointed expectations. Each game promised experiences that screenshots and trailers suggested would be revolutionary. Each game delivered somewhere between mediocre and barely functional implementations of ideas that sounded better in concept than they feel in execution. The aggregate cost of these purchases now exceeds $500, adding to your initial hardware investment in ways that make you increasingly reluctant to calculate total VR expenditure. The early access trap captures many VR buyers who are willing to accept incomplete games in exchange for promises of future development. These titles sell at full price while clearly marked as works in progress, with roadmaps showing ambitious feature additions and content expansions. The reality is that many VR early access games never leave development because the limited market can't support the continued investment required to complete them. You now own several games that will never be finished, abandoned by developers who couldn't justify continued work on projects that weren't generating sufficient revenue. The multiplayer ghost town phenomenon affects virtually every VR game that includes online components. You purchase a highly rated multiplayer shooter that reviews praised for its innovative mechanics and social interaction. When you launch the game, you discover that player counts have dropped to double digits across all regions and time zones, making matchmaking impossible and transforming the multiplayer focus into lonely tours of empty servers. The game that was thriving 6 months ago when reviews were written is now effectively dead, killed by the combination of small VR user base and new release competition. And the ported games from traditional platforms represent another category of disappointment that VR storefronts feature prominently. Publishers take successful flat-screen games and add VR support, marketing these ports as if simply adding stereoscopic rendering and motion controls transforms good games into great VR experiences. What actually happens is that games designed for traditional input and display feel awkward and compromised in VR, with control schemes that make simple tasks frustrating and camera perspectives that trigger motion sickness. Your purchase of a popular racing game VR port illustrates this problem perfectly. The flat-screen version is excellent, with precise controls and engaging gameplay that you enjoyed for dozens of hours. The VR version takes those same mechanics and forces you to experience them through a headset that makes everything slightly blurry, gives you motion sickness during high-speed sections, and requires you to deal with all of VR's physical discomforts while trying to enjoy racing that was better on a traditional monitor. The VR version costs $40 more than the standard version and delivers an objectively worse experience for anyone susceptible to motion sickness. The development challenges facing VR content creators explain why the content library remains sparse despite years of hardware availability. Creating VR content costs approximately 3 times more than traditional game development due to the need to model environments from all angles, implement interaction systems that work in 3 dimensions, and optimize performance for the demanding frame rates that VR requires. This increased development cost must be recouped from a market that represents 3% of PC gamers, creating economic mathematics that simply don't work for most projects. The platform fragmentation makes VR development even more economically challenging because developers must support multiple incompatible hardware platforms to reach the already small VR market. Each headset manufacturer implements different control schemes, tracking technologies, and performance capabilities, requiring developers to test and optimize for 5 or more distinct platforms. This fragmentation multiplies development costs while the combined market across all platforms remains smaller than single platform markets for traditional gaming. The motion sickness design constraints limit what VR developers can create in ways that traditional game design never encounters. Smooth locomotion makes significant portions of users nauseous. Rapid camera movement triggers vertigo. Vertical gameplay spaces create disorientation. These constraints eliminate entire genres and gameplay mechanics that work perfectly in traditional games but become problematic or impossible in VR, reducing the design space that developers can explore. The ROI impossibility facing VR developers has led to a vicious cycle where limited content selection reduces hardware adoption, which further limits the market for content. which discourages development, investment, which results in even more limited content selection. Several high-profile VR-focused studios have closed or pivoted to traditional game development after discovering that even well-reviewed VR titles struggle to generate sufficient revenue to justify development costs. Your exploration of social VR platforms reveals another dimension of the content wasteland where the promise of virtual communities collides with the reality of toxic behavior and harassment that platform operators seem unable or unwilling to address. The social VR space that marketing materials present as a utopian vision of connection and presence feels more like an unmoderated chat room populated by people whose behavior suggests they've never learned basic social skills or simply enjoy making others uncomfortable. Virtual harassment in VR platforms takes forms that are impossible in traditional social media because the embodied presence that makes VR compelling also enables harassment that feels more violating than text-based abuse. Users report experiences of virtual assault where other users invade personal space, make inappropriate touching gestures, or engage in behaviors that, while not physically harmful, create psychological distress that feels more real than similar experiences in flat-screen environments. The avatar-based discrimination that occurs in social VR platforms demonstrates that humans will find ways to create social hierarchies and express prejudice regardless of medium. Users make judgments based on avatar appearance, voice characteristics, and perceived demographic markers, then engage in exclusionary behavior that recreates real-world discrimination in virtual spaces. The anonymity that VR provides doesn't reduce discriminatory behavior, but rather enables it by removing accountability. The privacy invasion inherent in social VR extends beyond the obvious reality that other users can see your avatar and hear your voice. VR platforms collect detailed behavioral data, including movement patterns, gesture habits, speech characteristics, and social interaction preferences. This biometric data creates psychological profiles far more detailed than traditional social media platforms can generate. And these profiles are used for targeting, manipulation, and monetization in ways that users rarely fully comprehend when accepting terms of service. The deepfake avatar problem represents an emerging threat where malicious actors create avatars that impersonate real people, using voice synthesis and behavior modeling to create convincing impersonations that can be used for harassment, fraud, or reputation damage. The platforms that enable avatar creation rarely implement verification systems that would prevent impersonation, creating environments where identity trust is impossible, and every interaction carries uncertainty about whether the person you're talking to is who they claim to be. The surveillance capitalism business model that funds free-to-use social VR platforms means that every interaction, every movement, every glance direction, and every conversation is being recorded, analyzed, and monetized. The biometric data that VR systems collect is far more valuable and invasive than anything traditional social media can gather, creating privacy concerns that most users don't recognize while they're enjoying seemingly free services that are actually extracting value from their behavioral data. The virtual casino and gambling integration in some VR platforms demonstrates how the immersive nature of VR can be weaponized to exploit users through gambling mechanics that feel more compelling and addictive than flat screen. Equivalence. The presence and embodiment that make VR engaging also make slot machines and card games more psychologically manipulative, targeting the same reward systems that gambling addiction exploits while making regulatory oversight more difficult. The enterprise VR applications that promise to revolutionize training and collaboration have largely failed to deliver on their potential, creating another category of expensive content that doesn't justify the hardware and development investment required to create it. Companies that invested heavily in VR training discovered that traditional training methods are often more effective, less expensive, and don't require employees to experience motion sickness, as part of their professional development. Your week spent exploring VR content concludes with the deflating realization that the sparse content library isn't temporary growing pains, but rather a fundamental characteristic of a medium that's too expensive to develop for, too physically uncomfortable to use extensively, and too technologically limited to deliver on its promises. The revolutionary content experiences that VR was supposed to enable remain largely theoretical, existing more in marketing materials than in actual applications that justify the physical discomfort and economic investment. Tonight you'll sleep having spent over $1,000 on VR content that provided perhaps 30 hours of actual engagement, making this the most expensive entertainment purchase you've made since accidentally buying a timeshare presentation. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to question whether emerging technologies deserve early adopter support or whether waiting for maturity and market validation might have been the wiser choice. Your fourth week with VR coincides with the peak of metaverse hype, when every tech company with a marketing budget is promising that virtual worlds will revolutionize how humans work, socialize, shop, and exist. Mark Zuckerberg has renamed his entire company Meta and committed to spending tens of billions of dollars building virtual reality infrastructure that he insists will replace the internet as we know it. You're about to discover that corporate visions of the metaverse bear approximately zero relationship to the actual experience of existing VR platforms, and that perhaps the biggest tech companies in the world can be spectacularly wrong about the future while burning shareholder money at rates that would make government waste look fiscally responsible. The metaverse pitch that's being sold to investors, media, and consumers presents virtual worlds as inevitable evolution of digital interaction, spaces where people will naturally gravitate because the experience of presence and embodiment is so compelling that traditional screens will seem antiquated by comparison. This vision conveniently ignores every physical limitation, technical constraint, and human behavior pattern that you've discovered during your VR ownership, focusing instead on a science fiction fantasy that sounds revolutionary until you actually try to use the technology for more than 15 minutes without wanting to vomit. Meta's flagship metaverse platform, Horizon Worlds, promises to be the future of social connection where millions of users will gather in virtual spaces to hang out, play games, attend events, and conduct business. You create an account with curiosity about how this vision translates to actual implementation. And what you discover is a virtual ghost town populated by corporate promotional spaces, confused users wandering aimlessly, and an aesthetic that looks like it was designed by people who've never seen good video game graphics and decided that low polygon cartoon characters represent the cutting edge of virtual presence. The active user numbers for Horizon Worlds, when Meta reluctantly discloses them, average around 200,000 users globally. This means that Meta has spent over $36 billion to create a virtual world that attracts fewer users than moderately successful mobile games that were developed by small teams with budgets in the hundreds of thousands. The math on this investment would be concerning to any rational financial analysis. But Meta's leadership remains publicly committed to the metaverse vision, while privately, according to reports from employees, acknowledging that current implementations are failing to achieve any meaningful adoption. Your first session in Horizon Worlds begins with avatar creation. And this is where you encounter the legless avatars that have become an unintentional symbol of metaverse implementation failure. Meta's avatars don't have legs because the company hasn't solved the technical problem of displaying leg movement that matches users' physical movements when most VR headsets don't track leg position. The solution to this technical limitation is to simply eliminate legs entirely. creating avatars that float ghost-like through virtual spaces in ways that destroy any illusion of embodied presence. The virtual spaces within Horizon Worlds range from empty to nearly empty, with most locations containing 0 active users. When you visit, the corporate brand spaces that companies paid substantial fees to create sit abandoned. Digital monuments to marketing budgets that were allocated based on hype rather than actual user engagement. The few spaces that do contain users are often populated by people who seem as confused about why they're there as you are. Wandering through environments that don't offer compelling reasons to stay beyond curiosity about what Meta has built with billions in investment. The social interactions that occur in Horizon Worlds feel awkward in ways that make traditional video calls seem intimate and natural by comparison. The cartoon avatars lack facial expressiveness that would enable nuanced communication. The spatial audio that's supposed to create realistic conversation dynamics instead creates confusing situations where you can't tell who's speaking or where voices are coming from. The gesture controls that allow avatar movement feel clunky and imprecise. Making simple actions like pointing or waving require more effort than the social payoff justifies. The content creation tools that Meta promotes as democratizing virtual world building are technically impressive while being practically useless for most users. Creating compelling virtual spaces requires 3D modeling skills, understanding of game design principles, and time investment that casual users can't or won't provide. The result is that most user-generated spaces are crude constructions that look like they were built in minutes because they were, while the polished spaces that do exist were created by professionals who would have been better served building content for platforms with actual user bases. The NFT integration that Meta and other metaverse platforms promote as revolutionary ownership models represents another layer of financial extraction disguised as innovation. Digital items that cost hundreds or thousands of dollars to purchase exist only within specific platforms, have no interoperability despite blockchain promises, and provide no actual utility beyond signaling that you have disposable income to waste on virtual goods that will be worthless when the platforms inevitably shut down. The virtual real estate scams that flourished during peak metaverse hype created a speculative bubble where people paid real money, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, for virtual land parcels that were supposed to appreciate in value as metaverse adoption increased. These purchases were based on the assumption that virtual real estate would follow physical real estate economics, ignoring the fundamental reality that virtual spaces have no scarcity because new virtual land can be created infinitely at zero marginal cost. Your exploration of metaverse real estate listings reveals asking prices that would be laughable if they weren't representing real financial losses for people who believe the hype. Virtual plots next to celebrity-owned parcels, virtual storefronts in high-traffic areas that turned out to have zero traffic, virtual concert venues that were supposed to host events that never materialized. Each listing represents someone's investment that's now worth a fraction of purchase price, if it's worth anything at all beyond serving as expensive reminder about the dangers of speculative bubbles. The celebrity endorsements that lend legitimacy to metaverse platforms are revealed to be paid promotional arrangements when you read the fine print that disclosure requirements mandate the celebrities and influencers who enthusiastically promote virtual worlds in sponsored content rarely use these platforms once their contractual obligations are fulfilled. The authentic enthusiasm that their promotions suggest is actually scripted marketing that they deliver for fees that make their claims of genuine engagement obviously financial rather than organic. The privacy apocalypse that metaverse platforms enable represents perhaps the most concerning aspect of a technology that's largely failed on its own terms. VR headsets collect biometric data at a granularity that makes traditional social media surveillance look respectful of personal privacy. Eye tracking data reveals exactly what users look at and for how long, providing insights into attention, interest, and psychological state that advertising platforms would kill to access. Meta's Horizon Worlds collects this data constantly, building psychological profiles that enable manipulation at levels traditional platforms can't achieve. The eye tracking capabilities that premium VR headsets include are marketed as enabling foveated rendering and improved interaction mechanics. What the marketing carefully doesn't emphasize is that eye tracking also provides second-by-second records of user attention that can be analyzed to determine interest in products, susceptibility to advertising, emotional responses to content, and psychological characteristics that enable unprecedented targeting precision. The biometric data harvesting extends beyond eye tracking to include movement patterns that reveal physical habits and health information. The way you walk, how you reach for objects, your balance characteristics, and your gesture patterns all create unique biometric signatures that identify you as reliably as fingerprints while revealing information about physical and cognitive conditions that you might prefer to keep private. This data collection occurs continuously while you're in VR. Building profiles that metaverse platforms insist are necessary for operation while conveniently also being extremely valuable for advertising and data broker markets. The emotional profiling that advanced VR enables operates through analyzing combinations of biometric signals to infer psychological states. Pupil dilation combined with heart rate variability and movement patterns can indicate stress, excitement, fear, or attraction with concerning accuracy. Metaverse platforms are developing AI systems that analyze these signals in real time, enabling content adjustment that manipulates users toward desired emotional states or behaviors without users recognizing that manipulation is occurring. The behavioral prediction models that result from this data collection become increasingly accurate at forecasting user action, preferences, and purchasing decisions. The data that Meta collects in Horizon Worlds doesn't just describe what you've done. It predicts what you'll do next, with probability estimates that enable targeting that feels supernatural but is actually just applied statistics on comprehensive surveillance data that you provided by using platforms that you thought were social experiences rather than data extraction operations. The data breach vulnerability that comprehensive biometric data collection creates represents existential privacy risk that most users don't consider when accepting terms of service. Traditional data breaches expose information like names, addresses, and credit card numbers that can be changed if compromised. Biometric data breaches expose characteristics that are permanent parts of your physical being and cannot be changed when stolen. Your gaze patterns, movement signatures, and emotional response profiles are part of you in ways that make their theft fundamentally different from losing a password. The accessibility nightmare that metaverse platforms create excludes entire categories of potential users through design decisions that prioritize able-bodied users while ignoring disability access. Users with mobility disabilities find that most VR experiences assume standing and walking capabilities that they don't have. Blind users are completely excluded from visual VR experiences. Deaf users miss critical audio cues that VR relies on for spatial awareness and communication. Neurodivergent users find VR overwhelming in ways that make the experiences actively harmful rather than simply inaccessible. The economic barriers that metaverse access requires ensure that lower-income users are excluded from virtual worlds that are supposedly democratic and accessible to all. The minimum hardware investment of $3,500 for premium VR headsets, plus the high-end gaming PC that most headsets require, plus the reliable high-speed internet that VR streaming demands. creates a barrier to entry that's higher than most physical world social spaces charge. The metaverse that's sold as the future of digital interaction is actually a luxury product accessible only to people who can afford expensive hardware and ongoing connectivity costs. The age discrimination that's built into VR design becomes apparent when elderly users attempt to use headsets and discover that the technology assumes physical capabilities, reaction speeds, and technical literacy that decline with age. The small text that's hard to read even for young users with good vision becomes impossible for older users. The fast-paced interactions that assume quick reflexes exclude users whose reaction times have slowed. The complex menu systems that require technical fluency confuse users who didn't grow up with gaming interfaces. The environmental cost of metaverse infrastructure represents another dimension of the technology's problems that corporate promoters prefer not to emphasize. The data centers required to render and stream virtual worlds consume enormous amounts of electricity, generating carbon emissions that contribute to climate change while enabling virtual experiences that provide questionable social value. The rare earth minerals required for VR headset production are extracted through mining operations that destroy ecosystems and exploit workers in developing countries. The e-waste problem that VR creates accelerates as rapid hardware obsolescence makes headsets worthless within 2 to 3 years of purchase. The expensive devices that you paid thousands of dollars for become electronic waste that's difficult to recycle and often ends up in landfills where toxic components leach into soil and water. The cycle of purchasing, using briefly, and discarding creates waste streams that the tech industry externalizes to environment and future generations. As your 4th week with VR concludes, you've spent hours in corporate metaverse platforms that have consumed billions in investment while providing experiences that are inferior to traditional video games, social media, and video calling in every measurable dimension except the amount of money wasted developing them. The revolutionary virtual worlds that were supposed to replace the internet have proven to be expensive tech demos that nobody wants to use for longer than the time required to confirm that they're not missing anything interesting. Tonight you'll sleep knowing that the biggest tech companies in the world are sometimes spectacularly wrong about the future. That corporate vision and actual user desire don't always align, and that perhaps billions of dollars in metaverse investment could have been better spent solving actual problems that people have rather than creating virtual worlds that people don't want to inhabit. Tomorrow will bring the final chapter of your VR journey, where you'll discover what happens when reality finally catches up to hype and the metaverse dream collapses under the weight of its own impracticality. The Unexciting Dawn of Virtual Reality, Headsets Chapter 5. When the headset comes off, your final week with VR doesn't begin with a dramatic hardware failure or a catastrophic software crash. It begins with a quiet announcement that scrolls past in your news feed. Meta is shutting down consumer VR development and pivoting exclusively to enterprise applications. The company that renamed itself after the metaverse, that spent $36 billion building virtual worlds, that insisted VR was the inevitable future of human interaction, has essentially admitted defeat and is abandoning the consumer market that was supposed to validate its entire strategic vision. The news hits different when you're personally invested, both financially and emotionally, in technology that major corporations are now openly acknowledging has failed to achieve mainstream adoption despite years of aggressive promotion and unlimited budgets. Your $3,500 headset hasn't technically become obsolete, but the platform support and content development that made it theoretically valuable are being withdrawn by the company that manufactured it. You're now holding expensive electronics that are entering a death spiral where declining support accelerates user abandonment, which further justifies declining support. The cascade of bad news continues throughout the week as other VR industry pillars begin crumbling. Sony announces that PlayStation VR 2 production is being significantly reduced due to lower than projected sales and high return rates. The return rate data that leaks suggests that over 40% of PlayStation VR 2 purchasers returned their headsets within the return window, citing motion sickness, discomfort, and content disappointment as primary reasons. These aren't early adopters with unrealistic expectations, but mainstream consumers who were willing to try VR and decided definitively that they didn't want it. Apple's Vision Pro, the $3,500 headset that was supposed to bring Apple's design excellence and ecosystem integration to VR, has become the most prominent tech failure since the company's various missteps that people prefer not to discuss in detail. The device that was marketed as revolutionary spatial computing has sold in numbers that would be considered disastrous for a standard product launch and catastrophic for something positioned as the future of computing. The return rates exceed even PlayStation VR 2's concerning numbers, with users citing weight, discomfort, limited functionality, and the fundamental question of why anyone needs a $3,500 face computer when laptops and phones exist. The developer exodus from VR platforms accelerates as studios that bet their futures on virtual reality pivot desperately to traditional game development or shut down entirely after burning through investment capital on products that the market decisively rejected. The VR-focused studios that were supposed to pioneer the medium's artistic potential are instead becoming cautionary tales about the dangers of building businesses around technologies that consumers don't actually want, regardless of how much corporations insist they should want them. Your own VR content library, accumulated over weeks of attempting to find experiences that justified your hardware investment, becomes increasingly worthless as developers abandon support and servers shut down. The multiplayer games that you purchase become unplayable as player populations dwindle to zero. The live service games that promised ongoing content updates instead post notices that all development has ceased and servers will close within 60 days. The early access titles that you supported based on ambitious roadmaps will never be completed because the studios developing them no longer exist. The financial calculation that you've been avoiding becomes unavoidable as you tally total VR investment against actual value received. $3,500 for the headset, $2,000 for the gaming PC upgrade that VR required, $1,500 for VR games and applications. Over $9,000 invested to gain access to experiences that made you nauseous, gave you neck pain, isolated you from family, and provided perhaps 60 hours of actual engagement before motion sickness and discomfort made continued use intolerable. You've spent over $150 per hour of actual VR usage, making this the most expensive entertainment investment you've ever made, excluding the time you accidentally bought a boat. The health crisis recognition that's emerging around VR use provides medical validation for the physical problems you've been experiencing. Ophthalmologists are publishing studies showing that extended VR use can cause lasting vision problems, particularly in young users whose visual systems are still developing. The vergence accommodation conflict that you experienced as eye strain has been linked to changes in how eyes focus and converge, potentially causing permanent effects that persist long after headset removal. The posture epidemic that physical therapists are observing among VR users confirms that your neck pain wasn't just personal weakness, but rather a predictable consequence of strapping 500 grams of electronics to your head for extended periods. Chronic neck and shoulder problems are being diagnosed in VR enthusiasts at rates that alarm medical professionals who are seeing patients develop musculoskeletal damage typically associated with workplace injuries rather than entertainment technology. The psychological damage studies that are beginning to emerge paint concerning pictures of reality dissociation, social isolation, and addiction patterns among heavy VR users. The immersive nature that makes VR compelling also makes it psychologically dangerous for for users who struggle with escapism or have difficulty maintaining boundaries between virtual and physical experience. The case studies include users who develop depression after spending more time in virtual worlds than physical reality, experiencing their actual lives as inferior versions of the virtual existences they'd constructed. The addiction treatment programs that are emerging specifically for VR dependency represent the medical profession's acknowledgement that immersive technology creates compulsive usage patterns that resemble substance abuse in their psychological mechanisms and behavioral consequences. Users report craving VR experiences, neglecting physical world responsibilities, and experiencing withdrawal symptoms when prevented from using headsets. The treatment approaches mirror those used for gaming addiction, but with additional complications created by VR's physiological effects. The lawsuit wave that's building against VR manufacturers includes class action filings alleging that companies knowingly sold hardware that causes motion sickness, vision problems, and other health effects while downplaying or concealing these risks in marketing materials. The legal theories parallel tobacco litigation strategies, arguing that manufacturers had internal research showing health risks but chose to prioritize sales over safety warnings that might have reduced revenue. The medical warning labels that are appearing on VR packaging represent too little too late acknowledgement of health risks that users like you discovered through personal experience rather than adequate disclosure. The warnings that now advise against extended use, caution about motion sickness, and recommend regular breaks should have been prominent from the beginning rather than added after years of users reporting problems that manufacturers dismissed as individual sensitivities rather than systemic technology limitations. The technical dead end that VR represents becomes clearer as you understand the fundamental physics problems that no amount of engineering improvement can solve. Motion sickness results from sensory conflict that occurs when visual movement doesn't match vestibular input. And this conflict is inherent to VR's basic operation rather than a bug that can be fixed through better hardware, short of directly interfacing with nervous systems in ways that raise obvious ethical concerns. VR will always create sensory conflicts that make significant portions of users nauseous. The resolution requirements for truly convincing VR exceed what current display technology can deliver at consumer prices. Calculations suggest that matching human visual acuity would require approximately 16,000 pixels per eye, compared to current headsets' 2,800 pixels per eye. The processing power required to render 16K stereoscopic images at 90+ frames per second doesn't exist in consumer hardware and won't exist for decades based on current progress rates in GPU development. The wireless latency problem represents another fundamental limitation that physics places on VR development. Wireless VR requires transmitting high-resolution video streams with latency under 20 milliseconds to avoid motion sickness. But wireless protocols operate near theoretical limits imposed by the speed of light and signal processing requirements. Improvements can reduce latency incrementally, but can't eliminate the fundamental delays that wireless transmission creates compared to wired connections. The battery technology limitations ensure that wireless VR headsets will continue to require frequent recharging that interrupts extended use. Current battery energy density makes all-day wireless VR physically impossible without making headsets significantly heavier through larger batteries that would create even worse neck strain. The battery technology improvements that would enable day-long wireless VR are decades away based on current research progress and may never arrive if lithium battery chemistry is approaching theoretical limits. The haptic feedback impossibility represents another area where VR's promises exceed what technology can deliver. Convincing touch sensation requires mechanical feedback that current controllers can't provide without becoming bulky, expensive, and power-hungry. Full-body haptics remain science fiction that would require mechanical suits that cost thousands of dollars and make VR even more physically constraining than current implementations. The vision of naturally interacting with virtual objects will remain a vision rather than reality for the foreseeable future. The resale market collapse for VR hardware provides final confirmation of the technology's failed adoption. Your $3,500 headset that you purchased months ago now has a resale value of approximately $400, representing nearly 90% depreciation in less than a year. The market is flooded with used VR headsets from disappointed early adopters attempting to recoup some portion of their investments, creating supply that vastly exceeds demand from the diminishing pool of people still willing to try VR despite overwhelming evidence that it doesn't deliver on its promises. The retail returns that plague VR sales represent clear consumer rejection of technology that corporations insisted was revolutionary. The 40% return rate for PlayStation VR 2. The concerning numbers for Apple Vision Pro and similar patterns across all VR platforms demonstrate that consumers are willing to try VR but decisively reject it after experiencing the reality of motion sickness, discomfort, and content disappointment that early adopters have been reporting for years. Your decision to finally remove your VR headset for the last time comes not from dramatic failure or catastrophic disappointment, but from simple recognition that the technology doesn't fit into your life in ways that justify its physical discomfort, social isolation, and opportunity costs. The hours you spent in VR could have been spent in physical reality with family, friends, and experiences that don't require strapping electronics to your face and accepting nausea as the price of entertainment. The storage box that becomes your headset's final resting place contains over $9,000 in failed technology investments. The headset itself, controllers, base stations, cables, and accessories that seemed necessary when you believed VR represented the future. This box joins similar boxes containing other abandoned technologies that promised revolution but delivered disappointment. 3D televisions, motion control cameras, smart glasses, and various other gadgets that were supposed to change how humans interact with technology but instead changed how humans recognize hype cycles. As your VR journey concludes, you understand that you've participated in one of technology's recurring patterns where corporate vision, engineering ambition, and marketing hype combine to create products that nobody actually wants despite unlimited budgets attempting to convince them otherwise. The VR failure isn't about lack of trying or insufficient investment, but rather about fundamental mismatches between what technology can deliver and what humans actually want from their entertainment and social experiences. Tonight you'll sleep without the neck pain that became routine during your VR ownership, without the eye strain that persisted for hours after each session, and without the vague nausea that you'd begun accepting as normal. Tomorrow will bring the clarity that comes from abandoning expensive mistakes and the wisdom that recognizes that some technological futures are better left as science fiction rather than attempted implementations that cost billions while delivering experiences that most humans reject after brief trials. The metaverse remains a corporate fantasy that will continue attracting investment from executives who mistake their personal visions for market demand. But for you, the dream is over. Ended not by dramatic revelation, but by accumulated evidence that virtual reality, despite its compelling theoretical appeal, delivers actual experiences that humans find physically uncomfortable, socially isolating, and ultimately less satisfying than the physical reality that evolution spent millions of years adapting us to inhabit. Sweet dreams of technologies that understand human limitations instead of trying to overcome them, of innovations that improve life without requiring people to strap uncomfortable electronics to their faces, and of a future where perhaps we've learned that some visions should remain visions rather than becoming expensive lessons about the difference between what sounds revolutionary in marketing materials and what actually works when confronted with human biology and behavior. The headset is off. Reality with all its limitations and lack of virtual enhancement, feels pretty good by comparison.